today Ajahn Fred is going to share his work on R&D and economic geography. Fred, thank you for being our first CMaker, our first speaker this term.
Thank you very much.
Fred, how long do you plan your talk?
Why, I don't know. It depends. I don't know. I mean, I have 25 slides, so it should be. Usually, I count 2 minutes per slide, but
how about we aim for like 30 minutes first, so people can like discuss your work after this. And but if you need some time, that is okay too.
30 minutes will be difficult, I suppose, but I mean, actually, well, we will see.
Don't worry, that's okay. That it's not a formal structure anyway. Yeah. I will tell you when you reach 30 minutes. Okay. So.
Okay. So.
Okay. So and if anyone has.
Yeah, of
Sorry,
course.
Fred. I think I speak
you
too
are
much.
Free to interrupt me whenever you want. Interrupt me whenever you want, and I will try to answer the best way I can, if I can answer.
Sounds good.
So we'll start the presentation of this paper, which is R&D-led growth and economic geography. So it's a co-authored paper with Martha Alloy from Nottingham and Joanna Poyagote Otoki from Melbourne. Just to give a brief history of this paper, it's a 7 years old paper. I mean, we started 7 years ago, simply because, well, I mean, as you know, I was working in Nottingham before joining Thailand, so I knew Martha, and I was writing papers with Martha, and one day, Joanna, who was also a member of staff in Nottingham, saw one paper with Martha and myself and said, "Well, it would be nice if we can work together." And so the question was to pick up a topic in which the three of us could fit, because the point is that Martha and me, we are specialists of growth theory, and Joanna is more specialist of industrial organization, microeconomic. And so what we have chosen to do is to study economic geography, and the big issue was that none of us knew anything about economic geography, so we had to learn about it, which is a good thing. So, and that's why actually economic geography was a good topic, because we could mix the three talents, a big industrial organization part from Joanna, and the economic growth part from Martha and myself. Approximately, that's how we divided the work. So what was the context and the motivation, basically, of this work? Because we started from scratch, as I told you. None of us knew anything about economic geography, so we had to start to look at the literature. And what we quickly realized is that what we call the new economic geography, although it's 30 years old, which this new economic geography, which started with the work of Krugman in 1991, what this new economic geography was telling us is that when you have inter-regional transaction costs, but this leads to agglomeration. So basically, the important factor to shape the geography of an economy is the transaction costs. The problem, so that's the theoretical result. The problem of this is that this is not supported by empirical evidence. So of course here I skip lots of papers that we cite in the paper, but you can have, you can look at the details of the paper inside the final version of our paper. So this is not supported by empirical evidence. So of course, our goal there is to try to find a model, to develop a model which could actually fit with this kind of empirical evidence. And when we look at this literature, which started with Krugman, we quickly realize that especially models which are mixing growth theory and economic geography, that they are using the basic model of Roma 1990, which is the seminal paper about research and development, where you consider monopolistic competition. And what is very interesting is that's why I was talking about 2014 in the introduction, is that at the same time, we found this paper by Tabuchi, Tis, and Zhu, who are specialists about economic geography. We found this paper in 2014 about these big names in economic geography, they were telling us that technical progress, in fact, is the main force behind the process of agglomeration. And in 2014, their paper was in a working paper version, and their paper is micro-based. And so for us, we took this as a basis to say, well, look how we can integrate the argument of Tabuchi, Tis, and Zhu into a growth model, because of course, growth model is all about technical progress and the formalization of technical progress. So when we started the paper, the first thing that we try to do is to depart from the standard new economic geography model. And instead of having monopolistic competition, the first assumption we modified is to assume an oligopolistic model of innovation and growth. So that's the first thing. And instead of having a single research and development sector in the economy, we assume in-house research and development, which follow up a bit the models developed by Pareto at the beginning of the 2000s. And what we did in this formalization of the research and development sector is to assume that depending on the location of firms, because as we will see, we have different regions in the model, but firms may obtain different knowledge spillover. So that's the first thing we made in terms of changing the new economic geography models. And second, in the new economic geography models, what we realized is that usually in these models, workers cannot migrate from one region to another. And actually, they formalize what we call an agricultural sector, where individuals cannot move. Actually, it's a trick to keep actually the geography of the model and to keep two regions which are producing goods. So here we modified also this assumption, and basically we introduced the idea that workers can move across regions, but of course, when they move at a cost. I will develop all these ideas in more details when I will present the model. Anyway, but that's the key ideas about the formalization. And then based on these ideas, we ask two simple questions. The first one, which is how do knowledge spillovers together with migration costs, because that's the novelties that we introduced into the model. determine the economic geography of a country. And of course, because we are using a growth model, we are looking at the effects on growth, but also looking at inter-regional inequality, because that's another thing that we do in this model compared to the new economic geography models, is to look at inter-regional inequality. So just to give a quick review about the related literature, again, keep in mind that here, this is not exhaustive. I just give the main papers we used, or actually to which our paper relate, but of course the list is far from exhaustive. So first, there is a set of paper by Martin and Ottaviano. So basically, it's what I said. In these papers, they use a model of endogenous growth, which is the one developed by Roma in 1990. And the result they obtain is the standard result of economic geography. The fact that lower transaction costs influence the growth and the geography. The novelty, and that's why we relate this paper to our work, is that these transaction costs have an impact on the geography of the economy and growth, of course, only if the spillovers are local, but not if they are global. Which leads, when the spillovers are local, which leads to the agglomeration of activities in the most productive region. I will come back on this because when I develop the model again, because this is an issue that we discuss a lot in our work. And of course, as I mentioned, there is the paper by Tabushitis and Zhu, which is actually now published. It has been published in 2018 or 2019, something like that. So, well, I should modify here the date, but I wanted to keep it just because actually what we started with the working paper version, which is actually very close to the published one as usual. So what do Tabushitis and Zhu tell us is simply that the distribution of activities is determined by the interplay between labor productivity. So labor productivity is what they call technical progress, but in their model, as I mentioned, it's a micro model without growth. So basically, technological progress is taken exogenous. This is affected so by technological progress and the migration costs of individuals. And in their model, technological progress, because it's exogenous and uniform, affects all regions equally. And so here, that's other modification that we bring to the economic geography, in the sense that in our model, technological progress will be endogenous and will not necessarily affect all regions equally. So here, basically, we have a picture of what we do, what people have done, and how we modified the existing works. So what are the key results that we obtained? So first, and that's one of the key results of the paper, the first one is the fact that in our model, transaction costs do not matter for the location of sectors. That is, it's a result which is completely at odds with the standard result in new economic geography. However, as I mentioned, it fits with what empirical results are telling us. So, which is the good news or the two good news. But what we show, because we introduce transaction costs in our model anyway, what we show is that they matter for the level of wage of individuals. So that's the first result. And then after, when we look in more details about what happens in our model, we show that when you have higher regional dispersion in knowledge spillover, you can have agglomeration. That is, both firms and workers locate in one core region. However, as we will see, this is not necessarily the case. Because, in fact, what we will show is that we can have dispersed equilibria even when you have a greater amount of knowledge spillover in the more advanced region. So the third result that we obtain, which is very important, is that when we analyze the dispersed spatial equilibrium, which is the main core of the paper, we show that higher knowledge spillover in the less advanced region will lead to a reduction of regional disparities and higher overall economic growth and higher welfare also. But no. So that's the result. So now, what about the model? So how do we construct the model to obtain these results? But the basics of the model are standard, I would say. We just follow the main structure of new economic geography models, and we bring our modifications here and there. That is, we assume that we have two regions in the economy, and these two regions are identical, except for two things. Well, the first thing is standard. It's what the new economic geography models assume. The two regions are different according to their transaction cost, a point on which I will come in more details next. Then, and that's the innovation of this paper, or one innovation of this paper, the regions are different according to the capacity to absorb knowledge. That is what we call knowledge spillover. And I will justify this later when we will come to the specification of the research and development technology. Second, we assume, as I mentioned at the beginning in the introduction, in-house R&D. So this is an element which you can find in the papers by Pareto in the beginning of the 2000s. But instead of, in contrast with Pareto, who assumes Bertrand competition, so he has an oligopolistic model, but with Bertrand competition. Instead, we prefer to assume Cournot competition. Then, within this model, we will assume that we have many different varieties of goods, which are produced by many firms in many sectors. And as it is the case in standard R&D-based model, research and development is conducted by researchers or workers who are imperfectly mobile across regions. Okay, so that's the migration costs that we introduce in our model. So here I should mention that the version of the model that I present you is a simplified version of the model. And I will just point out to you the modification that we brought and how the model can be extended to be more general. But despite all the extensions that I will discuss about in this presentation, none of the results will change. So it does not affect any of the results that I will present you with this simplified version. So of course, we are using a growth model. So we assume that we have an infinite horizon starting from 0 going to infinity. And regarding firms, we assume that basically we have a great number of sectors in the economy that are producing goods that we call differentiated goods, and that we denote by J. And J is going from 1 to N. So here I should mention that N is an exogenous number. It is exogenous. And it is fixed. However, it is possible to consider a growing number of variety of goods, of differentiated goods in the economy. We have a special section dealing with this problem in the main version of the paper. Within each of these sectors, and that's where firms will compete in a corner way, you have QJ firms. So if you look at graphically here, we have the sectors 1 to N, and for each sector, we have a number of firms. Q1 for sector 1, Q2 for sector 2, and Qn for sector N. And all these firms within a sector, they compete in a corner way. So basically, they produce goods, they engage in research and development, and they compete à la corner. For, of course, corner competition is there to be able to fund the research and development. And under this corner competition, we have free entry and exit. Again, here, this is a simplification. This is discussed in the paper. We could introduce a cost of entry and a cost of exit. This would complicate the model, but none of the results are affected. This is discussed in the paper. Most of the extensions or proofs of what I say are available upon request. So now to go more in detail, so what is the production function for differentiated goods? Well, this is a simple and standard production function. You find the same kind of thing in the models of Pareto. So each firm is producing a differentiated good that we call X, so XQG, because it's firm QG at time T. This firm is using its own stock of knowledge. So A represents knowledge or specific knowledge capital. And Lx is the quantity of labor that the firm is using to produce the good. Okay, so Lx QG. Nu is just a parameter which is exogenous. Now comes to the most interesting part, which is the R&D technology. So how is knowledge produced? So if you look from a global point of view, this technology is standard, because actually, if you think about the technology used by Romer in his seminal paper, knowledge is produced. Knowledge is produced using researcher in a quantity LA QG for each firm, and knowledge. But here comes actually the way knowledge is used by the firms. And we distinguish two types of knowledge. First, there is the knowledge which is produced in the north. So basically here, that's why you have a double sum, because You have all the knowledge which are produced by all the firms within the same sector. And then you have all the firms which are produced, in the north. Gamma here represents the share of sectors which are located in the north. And of course, 1 minus gamma is the share located in the south. And it is important here to point out that this parameter is endogenous. Okay, so the number of sectors in the north and in the south is endogenous. And then you have exactly the same type of formulation, but of course for the knowledge which is produced in the south. So just to mention in terms of notation, when we put a star on a variable, this is just to indicate that the variable is a variable coming from the south. So here, this is the knowledge produced from in the south. And of course, this is here the total amount of knowledge produced in the south. And mu here represent the degree of inter-regional knowledge spillover. And of course, we have similar R&D technologies for firms which are located in the south. But of course, here you would have a star. And of course, instead of having mu here, you would have a mu star. And instead of having A star, you would have A. And instead of having A here, you would have A star. Here there is a kind of mirror, a symmetric view of the way we formulate the stuff. By assumption, we assume that mu star is strictly less than mu, simply because, as we will see, we take the view that the north is, at the beginning of the horizon, more developed. So you can justify this by the fact that the northern region has better infrastructure, and so knowledge spill over more easily in the north than in the south. The way you can modify, there are several ways to modify this R&D technology, I should say, and again, the proofs are available upon request. You can also distinguish the knowledge spillover that firms are using within the same region, that is the intra-regional spillover. So we would add a parameter. This would complicate the analysis, but again, none of the results. Then we turn to individuals. And here we formulate also, again, a simple utility function to represent the preferences of individuals, which is Cobb-Douglas. And we can modify this utility function by assuming a more general CES utility function. But again, it does not change any of the results. It just complicates the computations. So consumers we assume that consumers consume all types of differentiated goods. And here alpha is just a parameter of taste, which we assume is the same for every good. Finally, we have to look at the budget constraint of the model, and this is actually a core equation in what we call the new economic geography model, because it's what leads to the result of new economic geography models, but not in the present paper. You have the budget constraint of individuals who are consuming goods which are produced in the north, but they are also consuming the goods which are produced in the south. So with the price PJ for goods produced in the north and price PJ star for goods which are produced in the south. So here we have added an upper bar on the consumption of goods produced in the south, simply because to make a distinction between the consumption of individual in the north consuming goods produced in the south. So basically an upper bar here, an upper bar on a variable, is just synonymous of a good which is produced in the foreign region. So basically, when we look at the budget constraint of individuals in the south, what we would have is a CJ upper bar star, but that's all. Now, when we look at the transaction cost, we set exactly the same assumption as in new economic geography models. That is, we assume that the transaction cost or transportation cost or iceberg cost are greater than 1, and they are given by the following relationship, that is, transaction costs in the north are lower than in the south. So that's tau d, and tau d star represent intra-transaction cost, that is, goods which are produced and consumed within the same region. And tau I represent the goods which are exported. Okay, so here you have an individual born in the north, living in the north, is consuming goods produced in the north, but of course he has to pay the transaction cost. He is also consuming goods which are produced in the south, but in this case, he also needs to pay the transaction cost tau I because it's coming from the foreign region. So that's how we formalize the transaction cost. So there is nothing new here per se. Just to mention another thing, now when we talk about labor and the labor market, in this model, we assume that we have a fixed quantity of labor. In one of the final section of the paper, we assume a growing population to show that it does not change anything. So it's possible to assume a growing population. The advantage of this is that we can get rid of what we call the scale effect, the famous scale effect that you have in basic R&D based models. But apart from this, we do not get much. So we have a fixed quantity of population in the world that we denote by LW. And we assume that a share eta of this total population is living in the north. So this leads us to the labor constraint in the north. So basically, the total quantity of labor in the north is allocated either to the production of differentiated goods or to research and development. And so that's why here you can find, you can retrieve the core of any R&D based model, except that here, of course, we have a share eta simply because we have two regions. But basically, this is the core of any R&D based model. Usually, labor is allocated between the production of goods and research and development. So, of course, we have exactly the same kind of constraint for the south. And, well, eta star, by definition, is given by 1 minus eta. We just make one additional assumption. So eta is an exogenous parameter also, at least at the beginning. We make one additional assumption on eta. We assume that eta is greater than 1/2. That is, the northern region has better infrastructure, so better knowledge spillover, but has also a greater population. Okay, so that's the two assumptions that we make, which again are standard in models of economic geography. Regarding the labor market, we assume that it is perfectly competitive. Of course, we will have a wage in the north and a wage in the south. For simplicity, we have decided to normalize the wage in the south to 1. Okay, so here, well, we take it as a numeraire. So now that we have seen the model, we can derive the equilibrium. So to derive the equilibrium, we do it in a we do it in two ways, in two steps. First, we derive the equilibrium assuming a given population distribution. That's why I was telling you at the previous slide that eta is at the beginning taken as exogenous. And then, of course, we will derive the spatial equilibrium in which, of course, the distribution of the population might be endogenous. So, but we have to use this trick actually to obtain the results in this paper and analyze our result. So, of course, when you proceed to the characterization of the equilibrium, perhaps I should go faster on this. We proceed in the standard way. We have to compute the demands for differentiated goods. So demand for goods produced and consumed in the north, the goods which are consumed in the north but produced in the south. We do this for individuals in the north, we do this for individuals in the south, and in the end, we obtain an aggregate demand function, which is the aggregate demand function that, of course, firms will take into account in their profit maximization process and Cournot competition. So when we look at the firms are just maximizing their profit, which is given by this equation. So that's where you see that Cournot competition is necessary to fund the cost of research, which is given by this term here. Because keep in mind that you have constant returns to scale with respect to labor in the production function of differentiated goods. So that's why you need Cournot competition to be able to raise the funds necessary to get research and development. So the firms are maximizing this profit with, we assume, free entry and exit, which actually this condition of free entry and exit will allow us to determine the number of firms active in each and every sector. And this number, QG, is endogenous. So the number of sectors in the economy, capital N, is exogenous, but the number of firms within a sector is endogenous. So here, when we analyze the equilibrium, we derive first the simplest possible equilibrium, which we call the symmetric equilibrium. Symmetric equilibrium, you may tell me, oh, Fred, here it's kind of very strong assumption to assume that every consumers, every firms are identical. I agree with you. And actually, in the final version of the paper, we have different firms, I mean, different sized firms, which can actually have different size. We have differentiated consumers. Again, this complicates a lot the analysis because we have to work with average, we have to assume distribution for R&D technologies, and we have to assume distributions for preferences of individuals. So in the end, we have to work with average, but it does not change the main result. So better to have a symmetric equilibrium in which everything is the same and where the result flow directly. So here, that's the definition of what we call a symmetric equilibrium. So symmetric equilibrium, careful, for a given region, okay? Because of course, when we say that the number of firms in every sector is the same in every sector, it's only for the north. Okay, we assume that it might be different in the south. After using, actually, we can prove it mathematically that in the end, this Q will be common for both north and south. But that's another story. That's a proof. That does not come from the definition. So same quantity of differentiated goods, same quantity of labor employed in each sector, and of course, same price for every good. This kind of definition, you have exactly the same for the south. And once we solve for the model, we obtain our first result because we look for the existence of the equilibrium, of course. And remember, at the first, we look for a given population share in each region. And what we find out is that to have existence of the equilibrium, you need a minimum population residing in the north to obtain the existence of the equilibrium. So when we have a population share in the north, which is greater than what we call here eta tilde, we ensure that we have a unique equilibrium, a unique steady state equilibrium, actually. And in this steady state, as I mentioned, we demonstrate first that the growth rate in the north and the south is the same. And second, that the number of firms in each sector is the same. And finally, there is a third result. This is not a very important result simply because this is a result which is common to new economic geography models. We demonstrate that the share of sectors, remember gamma, this is the share of sectors located in the north, which is endogenous, necessarily within the equilibrium is greater than the share of population residing in the north. And so this is a common result. This is what Krugman called a factor endowment effect. The most important result of the paper, actually, resides in these two equations, 4 and 5. These two equations give you the implicit solution of the share of sectors in the north and the south, and the number of firms in each sector. And actually, so of course here, to determine Q, you need to determine gamma first. But as you can see here, this equation number 4, gamma is determined alone in an implicit way, but determined alone. And this represents the share of sectors located in the north. And that's the great result of this paper. That is, as you can see, that this equation does not depend on iceberg cost. So that's the big novelty of, this paper. And because it does not depend on transaction cost, of course, since transaction costs do not appear in the second equation, the number of firms per sector neither does not depend on the transaction costs in the economy. So the first result that we wanted to differentiate ourselves from the standard models is there. The second result, that we obtained is that the wage, however, when we compute the wage, the relative wage, because remember that's the wage in the south, which is our numeraire, the wage in the south, however, depends on the transaction cost, as you can see from this solution. All the results that we obtain are given in an implicit way. But as you can see, the equations are simple enough to be able to solve by hand and to see what happens in the model. Finally, we obtain the growth equation. Of course, growth is endogenous and given by the following equation. So once we have solved for the model, we can play a bit with it and look at some simple comparative statistics. And so here, perhaps I can skip because there is no outstanding results and very standard results which follow actually intuitions. For example, the fact that when you increase spillover, you increase the share of sectors locating in the north. When you increase the spillover in the south, however, of course, it gives incentives to firms to relocate to the south. I mean, this is something which is very intuitive. Or in the same way, the fact that when you have a greater share of population in the north, it will give more incentives to firms to locate in the north. Now, what we do after is to characterize properly the spatial equilibrium, because that's the most important part of the paper. And before, of course, characterizing the spatial equilibrium, we have to define what a spatial equilibrium is. So here we combine basically the definition you can find in the new economic geography models with our own model. And basically, what you have to keep in mind is that a spatial equilibrium, or what we will call a spatial equilibrium, is an equilibrium in which individuals have no incentives to move away from the region they are originally located. So that's why here you understand why, in the first step, we assumed that the population share, when we were characterizing the equilibrium, was taken as given. And that's where now we introduce the migration cost, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this paper, the presentation, one of the innovations of this paper is to introduce non-pecuniary migration cost. How do you justify this? Simply when you move from one region to the other, you leave your family, you leave your friends, you leave the place you loved when you were a kid. So, well, you incur some kind of psychological or non-pecuniary cost. And this is denoted by M. And once again, we assume that M is exogenous parameter, and we assume that M is identical across individuals. But in the final version of the paper, we assume that migration costs are distributed according to some distribution. I mean, actually distribution in the north and in the south. The type of distribution that you use has no impact on the result that you obtain. That's the first good news. And second, it does not count at all for the north, because we demonstrate very easily that, in fact, migration never occurs from north to south. If there is a migration, it is always from south to north. It's always from the poor region to the rich region, but never the reverse, simply because in the north, but as you have seen, they benefit from a lower transaction cost, but also, and this is something that we show in the paper, they benefit from a lower price index. So in the end, you never have any incentive to locate from the north to the south, also because, as we have seen, the level of wage in the north is strictly greater than 1, which is the level of wage in the south. So once we have this in mind, so of course, here, what we do is to see whether we have migration or not, but is to compare the level of utility that individuals have in the north and in the south, taking into account the migration cost. So basically, people will decide to move from south to north as long as the utility differential that they have between the two regions is less than the cost that they incur when they move from one region to the other. And that's where the results become interesting because that's where we get to the spatial equilibrium. When we characterize the spatial equilibrium, we can demonstrate that there exists a critical cutoff value for the migration cost, which is such that any population distribution that we denote by eta 0, and if this eta 0 belongs to a set 0 to eta lower bar, we obtain always a dispersed equilibrium. So, well, what I was saying is that when the migration cost is too high, which actually is also an intuitive result, people will never move their region, and we will always get dispersed equilibrium. Just would like to point out for the notation here, we have a similar notation, m lower bar, eta lower bar, simply because actually when we define the cutoff value of the migration cost, in fact, when we determine it through computations, we at the same time, it's a 1-for-1 relationship, we determine a cutoff value for the share of population in which we obtain either the spatial equilibrium. I mean, we obtain a kind of cutoff value for the share of population in the north. And so when you observe this proposition, this leads us naturally to a corollary, which is the heart of this paper, because this is on this corollary that we work mostly to derive the most important results of this paper. That is, if we have a migration cost which is low enough, that is between 0 and m lower bar, and we have a population distribution which belongs to eta tilde, eta lower bar. Eta tilde, remember, this is the minimum population which is required to have existence of an equilibrium. And eta lower bar, this is the upper value which is required to get a dispersed equilibrium. Then we obtain a unique spatial equilibrium where individual and firm are dispersed. That's very important because now that we have this in hand, we can play with the model and really go into the properties and see what kind of conclusions or results we can draw from there. So, of course, the first thing that we try to look at, because it's a paper which is actually mainly, which is oriented to economic geography, we look at the impact of transaction costs on dispersion and agglomeration. And we find this proposition, we show this proposition, that is, if we are within corollary number 1, we can show that in the same way there is a cutoff transaction cost, so that either we obtain a dispersed or an agglomerated equilibrium. And we show that when we change the value of the transaction cost, for example, when we decrease the transaction cost between regions, between north and south, we have an increase in the level of wage in the north, but we also, at the same time, increase the size of the dispersed equilibria. Then when we look at this, and because this was one of the innovations that we brought to the paper, we look at the impact of spillovers, of course, on agglomeration and dispersion. And here, the same way as before, we obtain a cutoff value for the spillover in the south that we denote by mu upper bar star, such that either we have a dispersed or a spatial equilibrium. And what is important here is that we can have a dispersed equilibrium if the difference in spillover between regions are not too large. That is, we can have regions with firms locating in the south and individuals willing to stay in the south as long as the infrastructures are well developed. That's actually how you can interpret this kind of result. Then, of course, we look at what happens from a growth point of view. But here, I mean, the result is not very exciting in the sense that it's a result which is kind of obvious. When you increase the infrastructures in the south or in the north, of course, this is beneficial to overall growth. What is much more interesting is the fact that the size of the impact of an increase in the size of the increase in the absorption of knowledge is greater in the south, I mean, when the knowledge spillover in the south is increased compared to the north. We have this inequality. And so, of course, this result is important because this result is inducing us to say that, well, if you want to increase overall economic growth and reduce inequalities between regions, what you have to favor and reduce inequalities, basically, what you need to do is to improve infrastructure in the south. Well, perhaps I will just conclude because I have another proposition, but I think my time is up now. So, well, just a quick word on what to take home about this presentation. First, what this paper shows you is that knowledge spillover and migration costs together that shape the equilibrium outcome and not transaction cost compared to what new economic geography is telling you. So whether you have agglomeration or dispersion. And the other important result, which is the one I just pointed out before coming to this conclusion, is the fact that in economies where not all R&D activities and not all workers are concentrated in the most productive regions, then improving the diffusion of knowledge in the south will lead to a reduction of regional disparities and higher overall growth. And so that's why I think that's, well, time's up. So sorry for being so long and so lengthy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Fred. This is a very insightful talk. Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you to my director to have come and listen to me.
Thank you, Fred. Very fun.